Okay, welcome to this third and final session for today. We'll kick it off with Karla Matić, who will talk to us about overflow and visual competition. Take it away, folks.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, I feel like a pilot and I'm about to stir something. Yeah, thank you. Today I'm going to talk about overflow and I'm going to present some results from my PhD work and also some thoughts that kind of accumulated in the way that I would like to share with you, and then hopefully we can discuss it later on. And I chose this beautiful artwork here because I thought this captures the idea of overflow quite well. And the idea of overflow is that from the moment that we wake up in the morning and we open our eyes, it seems like there is a flurry of contents coming in. There is all these visual contents, colors, textures, smells, the smell of coffee. It's all these things that are kind of messing around in our conscious experience. But we can't quite report this, or it seems like when we try to report this or put it into words, it doesn't really do it justice. So this seemingly very simple question of how much do we see in a moment of conscious experience, how much information does fit into one moment of conscious experience has been the focus of a lot of debate in the last 10, 15 years in consciousness science. So if you ask the question of how much do we see in a blink of an eye from consciousness scientists, nowadays there are like two kinds of answers that you would probably get. The first kind of answer is we see loads. Perception is super rich, super complex. There is lots of details that fills in our conscious perception, but we cannot quite report it all because our cognition is limited. The other camp says, no, we actually see quite little. Perception is pretty sparse to start with. The things that we can report when we do experiments, when we try to ask people what they saw, they actually illustrate pretty well what we saw. The perception is rich and it feels, for some reason, it feels richer than it actually is. And this is the illusion that we have to try to study. But these are like two camps rich and camps sparse. And they haven't really been able to communicate really well with each other and reconcile the two opposing views. And today I will try to convince you that a way forward would be to redefine the question a little bit. So instead of thinking about the question of how rich is consciousness, I would suggest that we should redefine this question in more empirical terms. And I will argue that we should think more about the actual neural mechanisms that underlie the kind of processing in the experiments that we use to study the richness of experience. And we should study how this neural processing affects what is even possible to represent in the brain. If I show you many different things at the same time, what is it even possible for the brain to represent simultaneously and what isn't? So I will first present some evidence for the rich sparse view for both sides of the debate. Then I will show you some classic work on visual competition. And then I will present an fMRI study from our lab where we studied how competition changes neural representations. And then I will talk about some future directions and what would be the interesting questions to ask going forward. So the rich view, the main tenet of the rich view is the overflow argument. And the overflow argument says perceptual consciousness is richer than cognitive access. So when you're faced with a complex visual input like this image, the overflow argument says you're seeing all of these things in great detail. This is what your perception looks like, basically, even outside of the focus of attention. You see lots of colors, lots of shapes, people, animals, boats, umbrellas, all sorts of things. All of this stuff fills in your experience. But because your cognitive system is limited, you're not able to remember everything. So if I take away this image and then I ask you what was the color of the dress of the lady on the left, you will not necessarily remember that it was orange. But the idea is you did experience all of these things while the image was there. This was first formalized by Ned Block in a paper in 2011. And there was lots of opinion papers and empirical work coming afterwards and supporting this view. But the core piece of empirical evidence that the overflow view relies on comes from a study by George Sperling, where he asked the question of how much information is available from a brief visual presentation of a stimulus. So the reasoning here goes something like this. If I want to know how much information you're consciously experiencing, what I can do is I can show you an array of letters. Now I'm not showing the complex images anymore because that's a bit hard to control and manipulate. I'm showing the letters. Let's say I show you 8 letters, and then I ask you to report all of the letters that you saw. And you can tell me like 3 to 4 letters accurately. And then I do this many times, and I do this across many people, and always on average people report around 4 letters. But they say, well, there was more than 4 letters that you showed me, I just couldn't quite capture them all, I couldn't quite remember them. And the reason for this is that memory creates a bit of a bottleneck. So you might be experiencing something that's relatively rich, you might be experiencing lots of things, but once you have to convert this into a serial report, you have to hold it in a memory for a while, and then you have to go through this array letter by letter, tell me one by one, and by the time that you get to some letter, your memory is probably gone. And that's why using this whole report, we cannot quite estimate the richness of the experience that people had. The Sperling's idea was very clever, and he said, let's ask the people to only report a subset of the letters. So here I'm showing you a variation of the paradigm that we run in our lab. And here we are also showing an array of 8 letters. We are showing this for 100 milliseconds, so it's very briefly. You just flashed the 8 letters. But now I'm only asking you to report one of these letters. And you don't know in advance which of the letters you will have to report. The Q, indicating which letters you should report, comes only after I remove the stimulus. So if you're able to do this task relatively well, this means that you extracted all or almost all of the information from the array. If you're not able to perform this task really well, this means that you did not extract the information well. And the classical finding from this sort of paradigm is that we can then basically convert your accuracy of the report to calculate the number of letters you had available that you extracted from the stimulus. And then we can plot this on the y-axis here. So here we showed 12 letters, and then we are plotting how many out of 12 letters people had available. And we are plotting this over time. So the x-axis indicates how far away the Q was from the end of the stimulus. So the further away we are on the x-axis, the longer it took between the end of the stimulus and the onset of the Q. And we see that if we show the Q very early after the stimulus, so for example, if we show the Q directly at the offset of the stimulus, people have a lot of information available. 10 out of 12 letters on average are still available for report. If we show the Q 50 milliseconds later, they're already down to about half of the stimulus. 150 to 200 milliseconds, it seems like the information that people have available has already leveled off, and now they have 4 to 5 letters available for report. So we can see 2 things from these findings. The first, we can see why you are only able to report 4 letters if I ask you to report everything that you saw. Because by the time that 200 milliseconds has passed, you have only 4 letters left anyway. So basically you are reporting one by one, and then you're out of time. Your temporary memory is gone. You don't have any more information to report. The second thing it shows is that people have a very rich representation of the stimulus that they extract from the stimulus temporarily. So this has been used by the supporters of the overflow argument to argue that these are the contents of the rich perceptual experience. This is called iconic memory, this temporary store that holds rich information from the stimulus, which is then held for a very brief amount of time until this information is converted into working memory if it's necessary for the task. And these contents of iconic memory have been postulated by the overflow argument supporters to be equal to the contents of the rich phenomenal experience. So they make a strong argument out of iconic memory and consciousness. So this seems pretty plausible, right? So what does the sparse view have to say in response to this? Well, they say people do have a lot of information in the stimulus, but there is no strong reason to think why this information was conscious. These representations could have very easily been unconscious, or they could have been processed at a very shallow level. So the sparse view people say our perception outside of the focus of attention is more something like this. It's more like generic sort of thing. We can see some car-like things here, we can see some buildings, some lights maybe, but we don't see things clearly. And they said this is what the perception of this array looks like. Apart from the few letters that we can isolate and report, the rest of the array basically looks like this, generic. So this has been called the partial awareness hypothesis. There was also a lot of work on this. There was some work by Claes Jean that Adrian introduced already before on retroperception, basically showing if you show the cue within a certain time frame after the stimulus, this cue can retrospectively trigger your conscious perception. So the fact that the cue comes after the stimulus is basically the same as showing the cue before the stimulus. It does not make any difference. You remember this long-lasting post-diction effect that we talked about. If you show the cue within this post-diction window, you're basically going to trigger a representation that was unconscious to start with, conscious. This is why you can get these effects of people having lots of information available, even though it doesn't really tell us that this was conscious to start with. In turn, they show a lot of evidence showing that our conscious experience can fail pretty drastically in situations that you would never expect. In attentional blindness, change blindness, attentional blink studies, these are really dramatic effects. And I'll show you now an example of one of these effects. This is from a study of Michael Cohen. And I'll show you a video of what the participants did. They put people into VR, and their task was simply to observe the video in VR. People were moving around their eyes, watching the video. They did many, many trials. And then on a critical trial, something happened in a similar way like Nadine was showing us before, this like critical trial situation. So they're moving around their eyes, and the researchers are tracking the gaze of how people are moving their eyes. And then on a critical trial, what they do is that they will start desaturating the color of the periphery. So basically the color is, everything is becoming black and white, but because the displays are done in a gaze contingent way, where people are focusing is always colored, and some circle around their gaze is always colored. The rest of the periphery is suddenly turning black and white. So you can see another example here. Everything starts normal, and then it's turning black and white, and now most of the visual field is black and white, apart from the part in the middle where you're fixating your gaze. Okay, so this is a really dramatic effect. Most of your visual field suddenly turns black and white. And then they measured how many people failed to notice most of your visual field turning black and white. In the case where they desaturated everything apart from the 10 degrees of visual field, and 10 degrees of visual field is a bit abstract. It's basically if you take a fist and put it like this is 10 degrees, this tiny thing. So imagine now that everything else turns black and white, and you don't notice it. And 30% of people, 1/3 of this room, wouldn't notice that this happened. If you increase this by a little bit, half of the people don't notice. If you go to 30% of visual field, so 3 of these, then 83% of people completely fail to notice any change happening. So this is a very strong argument as well, right? It's basically saying that our consciousness is closely linked to attention. Because we are paying attention to the middle of our visual field, it's a very engaging video. We are in VR, stuff is happening. We just completely fail to notice stuff in the periphery. And of course, then after they told the people, they were very clearly noticing what was happening. This only works on one trial, right? Once you start paying attention to the periphery, you can very easily notice the color change. So to sum up this first part, there is lots of studies, lots more studies that I don't have time for, but there is lots of studies showing that or suggesting that perception is rich. But then there is also lots and lots of studies suggesting that perception is sparse, and they haven't really been able to talk to each other and resolve this. And some of the reasons why is because they can't really agree what it means for something to be rich, for some information to be rich. They also don't really agree on what is information. They don't really agree on what is consciousness, what it means for something to be conscious. It's just the eternal problems that we are running into. So what I would suggest is that instead of running more iconic primary studies and more change detection studies, which are not really going to convince anyone, it seems, we should figure out why perception is limited in different circumstances. What are the actual mechanisms of why we can't see many things at once? What are the neural mechanisms of neural competition? If I face you with many different inputs, what are the reasons why the brain can't process everything that hits your retina? Right? There must be some limitations inherent in neural processing, and by looking at those limitations, we can understand a little bit better what are the limits of what is even possible to perceive consciously? And then we can start discussing whether it's conscious or unconscious and all these things, right? But we can set the stage at a different level, because right now it seems that people assume that you can perceive everything that hits your retina consciously. So let's look at these neural mechanisms, and then let's see whether we can like reshape the debate a little bit more in these neural empirical terms. So this idea is not new, that competition and the brain has something to do with each other, but it hasn't been discussed a lot in the content of the richness debate. So the idea is basically that as we are processing information in the brain, well, no, I'll start from here. So we saw already this idea today earlier that processing of visual information in the brain is performed in a hierarchical fashion. So basically the inputs come into the retina, and then they're processed in more or less hierarchical way from V1, V2, V4, and then they come to the area IP in monkeys or area LOC in humans. And as we are moving along this visual hierarchy, what's happening is that the receptive fields of neurons are becoming bigger and bigger. So receptive fields of neurons in V1 are relatively small. They're responding to relatively small parts of the visual field. Receptive fields of neurons in area IP are relatively large, which means that the neurons have to get pulled. The activity of neurons is getting pulled as you're progressing along the visual field. So this means, as a consequence, that the receptive fields are competing for access to higher neurons representations. So the receptive fields of a neuron in IP are a critical processing resource for the neurons below. If you have multiple inputs coming on a low level, and then they reach the same neuron in IT, the IT will have to somehow resolve this competition, because it cannot represent both at the same time. The beauty of large receptive fields is that it can compute highly complex features. So neurons early on in the visual stream can compute features like edges and lines and simple things that only take up a small part of the visual field. But neurons in higher regions of the processing, they can compute features that are more complex, right? So I will demonstrate this idea. Well, this idea was captured in the bias competition model by Simon and Duncan. Lots of research has been done on this afterwards, and I will demonstrate to you what happens here using a toy example. So let's assume that we take a neuron in an area IT. So this is an area that encodes high-level contents, and let's say that this is a face neuron. So it's a neuron that likes faces, and this is this neuron's receptive field. So here we see the receptive field to which the neuron is corresponding. So if we show a face with this neuron, we are going to get activity that's relatively strong. So we show the face here, and then the activity of the neuron goes up, and then it falls down. Now we show a house with this neuron, and we see that this activity remains relatively flat. It's not modulated by a house, because this is a face-preferring neuron in our toy example. But now let's look at what happens when we show the face and the house together. This neuron is not responding as strongly as it does the face only. In fact, the activity of this neuron to both stimuli shown to its receptive field at the same time is modulated. And Simon and Duncan and lots of work afterwards showed that a good way to describe, a good function that describes the activity of this neuron is a weighted average. So it's an average of face only and house only response that's weighted by different things. One of the things that it's weighted by is attention. So if you pay attention to the left side of the visual field, then the activity of the neuron to both stimuli is going to resemble the face only activity. If you pay attention to the right side of the visual field, the activity of this neuron is going to resemble more the house only activity. So attention can act as a way to resolve the competition between inputs. And this might be one of the reasons why, when we are tending to one or the other thing in the visual field, we are experiencing it more strongly, because the activity of the neurons like this one is also representing this content more strongly. Now, this is, I think, a good intuition to have. If we rephrase the rich versus part debate more in terms of neural processing, more in terms of visual competition, we are emphasizing that there are some biological limits as to how many things our neurons can represent at the same time. I showed you one example of this sort of model of competition that creates some limitations and describes some limitations that has to do with overlapping receptive fields. There are some other models that we can think about as well. But then I was thinking in particular about this example that I showed you with faces and houses. And I was thinking, well, if we now go to this monkey electrophysiology work and we go more into I see some people smiling who did this study in fMRI. If we now go more in the direction of human fMRI, and if you look at the whole big populations of neurons that are encoding contents like faces or houses and so on, how does the neural representation of these object categories change when we go to presenting something in isolation to presenting something in competition? So here we have a situation where we present just one object, and here we have exactly the same situation where we present this object with some clutter surrounding it. How will the neural representation change? Will it change? So there's three ideas that we need to know before we get started on this. The first is that roughly object category is represented in the areas ID in monkey or LOC in humans. So basically, there's lots of work on this. It's a simplification, but it's good enough for our purposes here. And the idea is that there are areas here in the lateral occipital cortex where you can find strong decoding of certain object categories. So there are some areas where you can most strongly decode a hand category. There are some areas where you can most strongly decode a face category, and so on. The second idea has to do with position invariance. So there are two different ways in which we can think about representations of objects in the brain. One is the neurons that represent information that's related to a particular part of space, and the other is neurons that represent information across the whole visual field. And back in 2012 and later on, there was an argument that in order to perform object recognition, to recognize something as a face or as a house, we need neurons that are position invariant. So we need a neuron that responds to binoculars, I think in this case, regardless of where exactly in the visual field we present this object. So these position invariant neurons allow us to recognize a face regardless of where a face is. If it's a face neuron, it can't be tied to a particular position in the visual field. It has to recognize some faceness regardless of where exactly in the visual field it's presented. I hope this makes sense. If not, we can discuss it later. And these two types of representations, position dependent and position invariant, are both found in the human LOC. So if you go around here and look at these hands and bodies and faces and so on, these representations, we can find both position dependent and position invariant representations of these contents. So in my study, I was wondering how does competition affect, in particular, these two types of representations? Does it affect them differently? The reason why I thought it makes sense that it affects them differently and that it affects position invariant contents more is illustrated here. So let's assume that we have two populations of neurons. One population has small receptive fields, other population has large receptive fields. So this population here only responds to its preferred stimulus when we show it in top right. This population here responds to its preferred stimulus when we show it wherever in the visual field. So if I present a face to this small receptive field neuron, it's going to happily respond. If I present the face outside of the receptive field, I will not get strong activity. If I present the face anywhere in the receptive field, in the large receptive field population, it will respond. Now let's think about what happens if we introduce clutter. If we introduce clutter, in this case, it doesn't fall in the receptive field of the population of neurons that we are looking at. So we could make a hypothesis that clutter is not going to affect this representation so much, because the neuron can still represent its face without much effect from the clutter. On the other hand, if the neuron has a large receptive field, now the receptive field is suddenly filled up with other contents, This will modulate its activity, and therefore this should affect this representation more. This was the hypothesis of the study. So what we did is we chose 8 different categories. These are the kinds of categories commonly used in fMRI research: cars, faces, hands, animals, and so on. And for each category, we showed 2 different exemplars in 2 different orientations. And then we showed it to participants either in isolation, in what I will call single arrays, or all together in what I will call multi-arrays. We showed this for 250 milliseconds. Participants were passively viewing it. And now you don't see this bar down there, but it doesn't matter. We ran this in 19 participants, and the point is that we ran loads and loads and loads of trials. We ran 3 sessions with each participant, and the reason is because we ran lots and lots and lots of these kinds of trials. Because we expected the signal-to-noise ratio to be pretty bad here, we just collected lots of data so we have enough power. So then let's look at the results. I'm grateful to Nadine for explaining decoding analysis already, because now we have a bit of an idea of what we are working with. So what we do here is we take a linear classifier and we train the classifier to distinguish between pairs of categories. So let's say we train a classifier to distinguish faces from animals. And then we test the classifier either by looking at the data from the same position in the visual field. So this is basically, we just leave out one set and then we test on the same set. But then we also test how well this classifier generalizes to different positions in the visual field. So the classifier is still trying to predict whether it's a face or an animal, but now the data that we are testing on is coming from a different position. So now if there is some information in the brain about whether it's a face or an animal that's invariant to position, the classifier will perform well here as well as it does here. However, if there is only position-dependent information, the classifier will perform better in the same position than it does in the different position. And then we'll look at the decoding accuracy, that's higher than chance, across the different ROIs. And first we look at what's happening here in these single arrays. We see in early visual cortex, there's no effect, no information about object category as predicted. And then in higher visual areas, and especially in LOC, where we predicted, we see there is information about object category. We also see that there is no difference in testing the classifier in the same position or in a different position. This basically means that there is as much position invariant information as there is position dependent information about object category when we present them alone. Now, the critical question is what happens when we add clutter to the picture. We do exactly the same analysis, we just add clutter, right? We take trials exactly the same way, train everything exactly the same way, and for now,
why are you training on the cluttered presentations instead of a single object?
Well, first, I don't think it would work on a single object because this data is much thinner. So if you take on less noisy data, train on less noisy data, and then you test it on highly noisy data, the classifier will possibly not work. There is this work by Matić that imagery decoding actually works better if you train on imagery than test.
Yeah, we always find that.
Conversation.
But it just feels like you're answering a different question now, because you're not necessarily answering the question, does the object representation decrease in fidelity, right?
Why?
Because you're not just training on the object representation, you're training on something else.
Well, yeah, I'm training on object in clutter. So I'm taking an average of all the situations where this object appeared with random stuff. And I take an average across loads of trials like that. So the only constant there is an object representation. So if there is a representation of a face in this clutter, the classifier will pick up on the face. Yeah? Yeah, I think actually you would not answer the same question if you train on single and tested on multi. I think that's a different question, because if you assume the representations change when you have clutter, then you're testing whether they change or not. Yeah. So here we now look at what happens with multi-arrays. And first I will just show you what happens when we do this with exactly the same number of trials as we did previously. So we're now just working with very few trials, same as in the case of single arrays, and we basically find nothing across across the ventral visual stream. There is no information about objects. This shows a very simple thing. Clutter affects how much information there is. It's nothing new. It's to be expected that when you add clutter to visual displays, there is much less information compared to when you do this for single arrays. Now, it would be sad if I had to end here. It would be very sad for my PhD, but luckily I don't. So we collected 10 times more data for the multi-array. We have much more power. And with much more power, we can also see the effects being much stronger. So basically now in the area LOC, we see strong decoding of the object category, and we see also strong differences between position-dependent information and position-tolerant information. And we see that exactly as we thought from the beginning, because it makes sense. The position-dependent information is not affected as much as position-tolerant information. There is much less position-tolerant information when we clutter visual scene with other objects than there is position-dependent information.
There is information even in V1, right?
Yeah. There is information. I believe that you will find information anywhere in the brain if you have enough data. Yeah.
The clutter with neither animals nor places, with other animals. So.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's a very good question. It gets very technical, so I can tell you later the details.
About the previous result, you're saying that there's an equal amount of position invariant and position dependent signals. But if there would be purely a position invariant code, that should also allow for position dependent coding, right?
I think it's the other way around. The position dependent code can contain position invariant as well.
Yes.
Yes.
This where I mean,
Yes.
inversely, if there's only position invariant representations, you would have
Yes.
positive.
Yes.
And what this says is that there is in this data, because there is position dependent is not better. It seems like the signal is only position invariant.
Here,
Yeah, because
it could be. So basically here it is possible that this is all due to a position invariant signal.
exactly.
However, here, it cannot be that there is more position invariant signal than here.
Yeah, unless for design reasons that you.
Yeah.
But that's the.
Yeah, so the only thing that could be is that there is the same amount of position invariant signal like this, and then there is position dependent signal on top.
It doesn't mean that you think that signal becomes more position dependent when there's better.
So this is the idea. Yeah, the idea is that one way in which the brain shields the representation from clutter is by relying more on position dependent representations, because the position tolerant representations are noisier and reduced. That's it. So just to summarize this, sorry, my pilot equipment is falling. And competition reduces both position dependent and position invariant category information. Both of them become worse when we present objects in clutter, but it affects position invariant representations more than position dependent informations. So basically both are affected, some are affected more than others, when we add clutter to objects. So what can we learn about the rich versus sparse debate from this? What's the takeaway? The first thing that we can learn is that competition reduces the amount of information that we perceive. Unless you believe that we perceive something that's not coming from the brain, we show here there is a body of work on bias competition that I mentioned before that all shows that when you're adding multiple things to the same visual field, even if they're not directly crowding each other, even if they're not too close to each other, even if they're perfectly visible by itself, when there is multiple things at the same time, brain reduces the activity to all these objects. It makes sense. Think about what would happen otherwise. The brain represents one letter. And now, if it needs to represent 10 letters with equal intensity, it would just need 10 times more power, right? And that's not how the brain works. It can't just increase how much firing it has. It has to normalize this activity somehow. And one of the ways in which it normalizes the activity is that it represents less information. Therefore, I believe this is a strong reason to believe that if we present one thing and 10 things at the same time, we don't perceive them in exactly the same way. And the other takeaway is that a strong case of overflow, the one where we say that if you see one thing and then you show 10 of the same things, you see them in exactly the same way. This kind of overflow is simply incompatible with how brain resolves competition. It just doesn't work. So by focusing on these kinds of questions, I think we can make a path forward in consciousness science. I think it will be interesting to do some consciousness manipulations on this position invariance because it's closely related to the idea of semantic, high-level semantic information that's not purely visual. I think we can also investigate whether this is the kind of information that gets lost when we mask stimuli, for example. We can also think about the parallel versus serial processing in more contemporary neuroimaging methods. I won't talk about this in detail, but we can talk about it later. We can also think about whether competition is something that arises in feed-forward processing or in recurrent processing. So if this sort of bias competition that I talked about is something that's more a property of recurrent systems, or is something that arises already in the feed-forward processing stream. And last, there was this interesting idea of temporal oscillations in attention, which basically kind of shows that sometimes it's possible to represent two contents at the same time at different phases of neural firing. So a neuron can fire, like represent two things at once by firing first for one thing and then in overlap for the other thing, just in different phases. So this could be like one interesting way of how the brain could make more with the less neurons, basically. Overall, I think that focusing on this sort of brain processing and limitations more than just on the question of how reaches perception can make a path forward. In a similar way, like we cannot see light waves that are longer than 800 nanometers or something like that. We simply cannot see more than fits into our brains. So if we can understand what kind of information can fit into our brain simultaneously, this can place a limit on overflow. That's it.
Let's get some questions.
Super good work. Really interesting. I'm still trying to think about why I was so confused about the decoder, and I think my intuition would be that you wanted to look at whether the representation of a single object would be better than the representation of a group of objects. That's where they would often object is the crowd, and that's where I was going for, but that's not exactly the question that you're answering here, right? So I think I was kind of expecting to see a brain area in which you can equally well decode between single objects that are in the same position and single objects that are surrounded by other objects that are still in the same position.
So you're assuming that there is a different localization of information for single.
So when you receptive field, if you would have a receptive field centered on the left top in this image, you would expect that adding objects around it wouldn't really make a difference, right? So then you should be able to do equally well encoding with or without those objects around it. Why do you think that's not the case? Is that just because that camera doesn't have that resolution? Is that, or what's going on? Why does the signal drop so drastically?
Why does it drop so drastically here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it drops so drastically because there is much less information to start with. So if we had more power, it would. So then there would be a difference, right? So sorry, to answer your question, even the neurons with small receptive fields get competition, the effects of competition. So even though they are somewhat protected, right? There is still interaction, there is still this idea of device and normalization, for example, so that the larger population around is going to normalize the activity of this neuron. So basically there are effects, there's like lateral inhibitions on this neuron. And I think that explains why you go from this to this, in the blue, from this to this. Right? So, but I think you are right that we should look in particular at the different ROIs within the LOC and see whether there is a localization difference as well, a shift to different kinds of neurons, basically.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you. I really welcome opinion. So I had a couple of questions now, follow up on one another. did you control the eye movements and how long were the presentation times? I might have just missed that.
So we didn't control, but the participants were instructed to fixate in the middle. Presentation times were 250 milliseconds, so they're purposely too short for saccades. And the catch trial the participants had was to report whether they saw a prompt object in the previous trial. And in order to do this, you have to pay attention to the whole array. Basically, if you start moving your eyes, you're just not going to notice anything happening. So this makes me think that even if there were some eye movements, they were minimal. They were, yeah.
Cool, okay, I was worried that accuracy was covered, but that seems pretty short. So
Yeah.
the question is, why is it beeping? Or can you speculate a little bit about whether it's feedforward or feedback? So is this a feedforward indicator? Do you expect this to be seen, say, within the first 80 to 100 milliseconds, the feedforward split? Or do you think this effect would show up at 150 milliseconds? That seems really empirically practical.
Yeah, so a colleague from Radek's lab is now running this in EEG. And basically, she sees exactly the same temporal effect, regardless of whether you have single objects or clutter. So it's not that processing in clutter is slower or something like this. It has exactly the same temporal profile. It's just that in EEG, she needs 4 times as much data.
When does it show up?
I think it's like the regular 180 milliseconds, something like this. Yeah.
So in the feed-forward sweep, there's no difference.
Yeah, but you can't decode category in feed-forward sweep. Apparently. I don't know. So basically, here she can't decode category in the first, I don't know, 100 milliseconds. She cannot.
Maybe because it's a different example or something.
Yeah, there are different examples, exactly. So yeah, I don't know that much about the temporal resolved processing of objects, but so what I know is that basically clutter does not make a difference, at least from these like preliminary studies.
So there are experiments from Karla where it shows that with occlusion and with clutter, in order to resolve the identity of the objects, you often need feedback from PFC. So expect in those cases, you need longer, you need the stimuli to be presented for longer, or you need, more than the feedforward sweep in order to extract.
But 250 milliseconds is quite long. 250 milliseconds plus recording memory, right? So that's actually quite enough time. And I would argue that this effect is very local, this bias competition style. This is not the way in which attention is resolving the competition here is not by PFC attention. This is like a bottom-up kind of attention.
Surely in that particular case, subject attention determines all the objects in the array.
They're not a ceiling.
Okay.
Not at all. Yeah, it's not an easy task.
It's to me not a really shocker that accuracy or the accuracy drop when you have multiple patterns. But I'm more surprised on this, like by how much information there is to begin with, right? Like if you compare these two conditions, one item and two items, it feels like that there is a giant bonfire of new requiring about an item that is easily perceived, right? So why do you think there is so much information present? Is it just useless epiphenomenon of, well, I've got nothing else to do, so we can all fire together, or is it actually kind of still improved? Like is every smidge of firing still improving the person, the conscious experience of the person?
So you're surprised that there is so much information here in the clutter or in the non-clutter?
Right.
Is this a lot?
Well, by comparison, right, like if you give that at the same number of trials, you have basically nothing, right? That's what you show on the next slide is.
Yeah.
Same number of trials, you just have nothing, no.
Yeah.
Right, like by that comparison, that means that there's an order of magnitude difference, right? Like easily 10-fold different than SNR maybe, right? And that's a huge difference. Why is the difference so huge if it's just like 3 items, right? Like, what do we need all of that firing, basically, right? Is it just useless firing, or does it actually make a person better?
Well, I think it makes person better. I think it definitely changes the person. And I think the other thing that is happening when you go from single to multi is that here you have combinations of trials where you did see the decoding item, where you did not see the decoding item. Some decoding phase versus animal. And in some trials, people, I think, completely fail to see some of the items. Because they're not, this is not an easy task, as I said. It's only 4 things, but they're presented for 250 milliseconds. I think we are beyond capacity, basically, for perception. So this means that actually, in some of these trials, and the next step, of course, would be to differentiate the trials where we did see one of the items and then decode only those that they saw and those that they did not see, like a Sperling style thing, right? That will be the next step. But for now, I think one of the reasons why it drops is because sometimes you don't give us process some of the objects. And the other reason is because of these bias competition kind of interactions that I described before. If 4 things are falling within the same visual field, within the same field of a neuron, then they're reducing the information. Yeah.
We have time for a last quick question. There is one. No, in that case, it's time for our speaker. Thank you.